Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third screencast for the Introduction to Poetry and Great Poets class. I see that unfortunately on the second screencast, I went egregiously over my 10-minute limit. It was about 14 or 15 minutes. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to try to be a little bit more succinct this time and make it into the 10 minutes time limit. So let's just get started right away. Okay, and we'll just go from here. Okay, so here's the share. Everybody should be able to see this now. I'm just going to play from the start. And if you remember last time, we were talking about the genres of poetry and the three poetic modes of epic, dramatic, and lyric verse. And one of the conclusions we made was that most verse today is what we call lyric verse. Okay, so where to start with lyric verse. That's what the first PowerPoint is about. And the two forms that I chose, lyric forms that I chose to begin with, are the ballad and the ode. Okay, so I just start with the same slides that we've seen before, philosophizing a little bit about poetry, what it is, where it comes from, okay, and a little bit about the technology of poetry. Okay, so we need to put poetry together with literature because those are not exactly the same thing. Literature always being about writing, but poetry having a very strong oral component always from the beginning. And it's exactly that idea that I want to explore in the first PowerPoint about lyric forms. Okay, so to do this, we need to talk a little bit about the history of writing. Now, those of you guys who take my Introduction to Translation classes, you'll be familiar already with this map. And I use this map of the Roman Empire at its height, which would have been about 2,000 years ago, to talk a little bit about why the Russian alphabet is different from the English alphabet or German alphabet, for example. And it really has to do with the history of literacy. When you look at a big empire like the Roman Empire, what you are looking at, of course, is a political unit, an economic unit, but you're also looking at an educational unit. And the reason for that is because it is not possible to run an empire or any organization that is more than a one day's ride by horse from a central point without some kind of writing system. And so when you look at a map of the Roman Empire, you are actually looking at a map of literacy. In other words, everywhere you see red on this map of the Roman Empire, you see literacy. Where you don't see red, 2,000 years ago, you would not have seen literacy. You would have seen people who were basically illiterate, who had oral traditions, meaning lots of oral poetry, but who did not have any literature or any literary poetry in the sense of being written down. So it's really important to understand, of course, that poetry does not necessarily have to be literature. It can also exist in this oral tradition. Okay, a lot of the history since 2,000 years ago has been the history of teaching people how to read and write. And it is one of the miracles of the modern world that most people can read and write. So if you take a look, for example, at the country of France in the 18th and 19th century, you can see how dramatically the illiteracy rate fell over those couple hundred years. I think even here in this chart, it even goes by generations. Of course, France was, at that time, probably the most literate, best educated country in the world, even as much as or even more so than England. So the numbers here of the percentages here that you see would have been high by far compared to the rest of the world. But it's just an example of how steeply illiteracy dropped between, let's say, 1720 and 1885. By 1885, only about 5% of the population, according to this graph, which may or may not be accurate, but which is more or less accurate, only about 5% of the population was illiterate compared to just a couple of hundred years earlier where 65% of the population was illiterate. Okay, so that's important in changing how poetry is understood, okay? All right, finally, we have our present day situation where we have pretty much mass literacy. Now, of course, as you can see, there are still large parts of Africa, India, maybe even South America, where there are illiterate populations, but for the most part, we've reached more or less 100% literacy in Northern Hemisphere and much of the Southern Hemisphere as well. So mass literacy is pretty much the normal condition. It is kind of hard to imagine how we got to that situation in a few hundred years where almost everyone can read or write. But it has changed our attitude towards poetry. And that brings us to why it's a good idea to start studying lyric forms with the ballad and the ode. So a culture of illiteracy has been around since ancient Rome and ancient Greece and before in other places, and it's always been a culture of prestige. So in the past, people who could read and write were a very elite group of hackers, you might say. They were just a very small group of people who had mastered this technology, this software of being able to record language. And so that meant that literate culture was very prestigious. And if you could read and write in the Roman Empire, that meant that you were really in the higher class of people. The vast majority of people in the Roman Empire could not read and write, as was the case in most of human history until modern times. So there was this culture of literacy, the literary or literate culture, which was very elite. But the point is that poetry has always been with language. And in fact, you could even make a philosophical case that those two things are synonymous, that poets basically are just the makers of language. And poetry existed for millennia and millennia before there was ever any culture of literacy. So there's always been in poetry these two cultures, the pre-literate and literate culture. The reason that we want to start studying lyric mode with the ballad and the ode, which are two kinds of lyrics, is because they beautifully illustrate one type of lyric poem from each culture. So let's just go over the definition really quickly. A ballad is a poem that tells a story. Because it's in the lyric mode, that is, it's a song, it tells a story that is by definition short. It tends to focus on a single dramatic and personal episode in which the storyteller is not personally involved. The authorship of a true folk ballad, okay, so that would be from the pre-literate culture, is always in doubt. It's pre-literate, so we can't know who the author is. But there's also a long tradition of literary ballads, which are written in imitation of folk ballads. Okay, the other is the ode. The ode is a poem that celebrates something. That's the quickest definition. And it's a lyric poem composed on an occasion. It feels formal and ceremonial. This is because the occasion was originally an event, like a birthday or a wedding. In other words, a poem that you would read to celebrate this occasion. But later it came to mean any occasion or cause for celebration, like an idea, a person, a thing, a season, whatever. Okay, so various types of ode were developed in classical literature by authors like Pindar, Anacreon, or Horace, and thus the ode is highly literary by nature. So the ballad is a really highly pre-literary or oral type of lyric poetry, and the ode is a highly literary or written type of lyric poetry. And that's why those two are good places to start when we talk about types of lyric poetry or genres. Okay, so just to take an example, I'll do this quickly. I played for you guys at the beginning a ballad that my mother sang to me when I was a child as a native English speaker, and this was the Sky Boat Song. It's a beautiful ballad, and it's a folk ballad that was recorded and eventually made into a literary form, but that existed for centuries in one form or another as a oral poem that was not written down, and that was passed from mouth to mouth. A good example of a literary ballad would be something like Goethe's Erlkönig, or what we call in English the Elf King, and in Russian Lesnoy Tsar. And this is a literary ballad, which is to say that it was actually written by an author, Goethe, but it was written in imitation of folk ballads like the Sky Boat Song. The Brothers Grimm did exactly the same thing, except they were recording not poems, but stories. In other words, folk tales. And of course, everybody knows the Brothers Grimm tales. Those are actually literary folk tales. In other words, the Brothers Grimm heard those tales, but then wrote them down in literary form. The same thing was going on with Goethe. Okay, we looked quickly, I'm going to go fast, okay, at how this poem came into Russian through translation. And we talked a little bit about how translators work and what their function is in society. Zhukovsky made a famous translation of this Lesnoy Tsar. Marina Tsvetaeva wrote a famous essay about this, by the way. Okay, so there is a tradition of sharing folk traditions from various cultures, from one culture to another. Okay, so we just looked at that quickly. All right, now I can see I'm moving up on my 10 minutes already, so I'll try to be quick. All right, so I'm up to the last 10 seconds. Okay, so now let's talk about the ode. Okay, so the ode is just a great representative of a kind of poetry that comes to us from written elite scribal culture. So when I say literate culture here, I could also say something like high culture, or prestige culture, elite culture, as opposed to folk culture. An ode is a lyric poem that celebrates something and has its origins in the literate or elite culture of the ancient world. Okay, the most famous ode, just to give you an example, is called in German An die Freude. In English, it's called Ode to Joy, and it is the theme song of the European Union. Da, 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 joy. Okay, whatever. I won't try to sing it. Okay, notice it is singable though because it's a lyric. Okay, the most famous ode is the Ode to Joy, which is the theme song of the European Union. Okay, I think I skipped a slide there, but okay, whatever. Another famous example of ode, the most famous in English, is Keats's odes. And we talked about Keats when we get to the Romantic poets, and his most famous odes, one of his most famous odes is called To Autumn. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the introduction of two lyric forms, the ballad and the ode. Ballad representing folk tradition or oral culture, and the ode written or elite tradition. Now, what's interesting about these, of course, is that they foreground the relationship between these two cultures, and thus the problem of literary prestige. Yeah, why is some literature considered more prestigious than others? If you can see the problem illustrated fairly quickly, it's that literature, which once was the realm of a very small elite group of people, has over the centuries become a common quality. So many people can now participate in this culture that there's now a huge number of different tastes and different schools that appeal to people. And so we don't. So it's now a lot more difficult to say what counts for elite literary culture than it was a couple hundred years ago. Okay, so we can still talk about degrees of literacy, saying some people are better read or more literate than other, but even that is difficult nowadays, partly because we live in this globalized world in which there are so many different backgrounds and contexts available to us, and partly because there are new types of literacy that are evolving. So even though we can still talk about degrees of literacy, it's getting harder to solve the problem of what counts as elite or high or good literature. Okay, what the high culture literature is. So I just wanted to have three takeaways to keep in mind. Okay, the first is poetry has always been made from this exchange between more prestigious and less prestigious cultures. And you can define prestige in different ways. It can be the scribes versus the bards, in other words, the hackers versus the computer illiterate, if you wanted to update that metaphor a little bit. The academics versus the rappers or hip hoppers, the big language speakers like English or Russian versus the small language speakers like Kazakh or Uzbek. So there's always been this exchange, okay? So it's really good to keep an open mind about poetry. Okay, the second is that definitions of prestige are fluid. So if you had been a literate person a couple hundred years ago, that would have counted a lot higher on your resume than it does today, where everyone is literate. Okay, so and what seems prestigious in one context may not be in another, or just may be completely unknown in another. Okay, so snobbery is usually a sign of insecurity. It's best not to be a snob. Keep your definitions open, but also, keep your standards high. Okay, and finally, the definition of literacy is changing. This is probably the most important point. We're living through the greatest revolution in media tech since Gutenberg invented the printing press. There are whole new forms of literacy emerging. The most obvious is digital, but there's also cinematic and all sorts of various kinds. So poetry is going to have a whole new world because it's going to be recorded in a different way than it was before. And that brings us back to the slide we ended the previous one with, which has to do with where the future of poetry lies. And it almost certainly does lie in a brave new world of non-print digital technologies, which I hope we've been exploring through the class. Okay, that brings me to the end of this lecture, about 3 or 4 minutes over. I'll stop the share and I'll stop the recording.